Hello, friends. Welcome back to Swan Signal Live. Happy Friday. I'm Brady Swenson, your host. I'm here with an all-star lineup. You know Brandon and John and Steven, the regular crew. But we're here with two very special guests today as well. Lyn Alden, who I'm sure needs no introduction, but she is an investment advisor, analyst, investment analyst. What do you call yourself? Investment
Analyst, yeah.
Analyst, thank you. Okay. Investment analyst, and Ben Werkman here, who is become an expert on leverage Bitcoin equities and Bitcoin treasury strategies here recently. So a lot of you will know Ben as well. Really excited to have them join us here on this momentous day in Bitcoin history, everyone. We have an established strategic Bitcoin reserve. As of yesterday, an executive order was published by the White House, and it creates the strategic reserve that we have been speculating about for quite some time and was promised in one form or another. So let's get into it right now. Steven, you want to kick us off and give us a rundown on what the executive order included?
Yeah. So, I mean, what a night with this coming out, this being signed. Also, what a week leading up to it. What a month. It's been, nonstop. One of the most interesting and volatile, I think, periods in the recent weeks. But so we finally got the SBR executive order, and I thought it was fantastic. To be honest, I thought there was a lot of uncertainty coming into it. There were tweets about Ripple and Cardano and Solana and what is this going to be and are we going to get it? And coming into it, we saw the final product was just that so it's three things. One, we've got the stockpile. So we're holding the Bitcoin that we have. The government is going to maintain and stop selling all of the Bitcoin that it currently has from possession. There's some complexity here because there are the Bitfinex coins, and these may have to be returned. It's uncertain, and I think my video stuck, so I'm sorry about that. So I hope you can hear me. There is the Bitfinex coins, which are stuck, which need to be returned. So there may be some complexity there, but the rest of them will stay on the balance sheet for the US. Those will be in the reserve, and those will stop being sold. That was the outcome that I think most people expected. That was kind of, unless they really surprised us to the downside by not doing anything, we expected the stockpile. So great that we got that. I think what was notable, though, and what was unexpected and very positive was a couple of other things. One, they very cleanly carved out crypto from Bitcoin. And so far from having a reserve that was part Bitcoin and part XRP and part Cardano, they basically not only put Bitcoin as its own separate thing, but they even said that we're not buying more of any of these crypto coins. We're just not selling them. And actually, we might sell them even. We reserve the right to sell them, but we're putting them into this thing. And one of the things I think people should understand is that we're talking single digit millions for many of these coins. The US has de minimis amounts of some of these coins that were tweeted out, very small amounts. So it's basically nothing. And in doing so, they made some really interesting and clear statements on why Bitcoin is better and why Bitcoin deserves this special status. So we got an amazing carve out. And then the last part of it, which was very exciting, was, and in the original kind of tweet, they basically said something like they may consider budget neutral purchases of additional Bitcoin. In the actual text, they said they shall. They shall. Now it is come up with or design to create them. So there's still a difference between that and actually doing them. But the Treasury and the Treasury Department and the Secretary of Commerce, Lutnick and Bessent, have been instructed with coming up with budget neutral ways to buy more Bitcoin. This is smart for two reasons. One, they don't have to run it by Congress. And two, they can't be criticized for spending taxpayer money in the same way. So that's a high level summary. I'll stop talking here, but they really threaded the needle, I think, on a number of issues to come with an executive order that was very good.
We'll go to you next, Lyn. We'll mention that Bessent was on CNBC this morning talking about the reserve with Joe Kernan, and he was very clear several times that it is the intention to buy more Bitcoin. The language he was using was very clearly saying that we have the intention to buy more Bitcoin. We have to figure out how to do it. Same thing in the executive order, I believe, too, with the word shall. Lyn, what was your reaction to this moment? And if you want, why do you think price action is flat after it?
I think Steven summarized it well. I agree with the points he made. Basically, this is pretty much what price focused Bitcoiners would hope for is that Bitcoin is kind of separated from the others, that they're at least going to ring fence the coins they already have. That was at least my kind of lower end base case is, not trying to expect bigger things, and I'd rather be surprised to the upside than the downside. So at least got it seems like the minimal start, and then we'll see. I think the biggest there's a couple reasons I think why price action is not very great at the moment. I think one is that the market already kind of anticipated this. It's not really like a massive upside compared to what they expected, and to the extent that it could be because of the open-ended nature of trying to find ways to buy more Bitcoin in a budget-neutral way, it's very unclear on the timeline or the scale that will end up occurring. And so the market still has questions, and whenever you have questions, you have price uncertainty. Um, and then in addition, I mean, when we saw like Bitcoin consolidate for 7 months last year, right? So March 2024, it broke out, touched new highs, um, and there were some kind of like on-chain indicators you can look at that kind of give you a little bit of a measure of maybe euphoria or just kind of the sheer speed of the move. And so, for example, I like to look at market cap to realized cap. Basically, the ratio of market capitalization to like average on-chain cost basis. And when that becomes pretty elevated, sometimes the market needs to digest that because that's in some ways it's like a temporary price. It's like if one house on a block sells and all the houses get repriced, it's like, well, is that really the new liquid price at the street, or maybe does it need more time to actually get there? So I think that Bitcoin had this like 7 month consolidation. It wasn't nothing was as euphoric as we see in multi-year tops historically that Bitcoin's had, but it was a little frothy. We worked that out, and I think we saw kind of similar ratios back in November 2024 after the election when it broke out to kind of the first time it was touching 100K. We had similar kind of a consolidation since then at around a similar kind of market value to realized value ratio. So it's not that surprising to see that the market needs time. There was a lot of euphoria around MicroStrategy at the time as well. I mean, it was trading at like over 3 times NAV, if I remember correctly. And these things just kind of take a time to digest. So I think that's kind of where we are with the market. The way that I generally talk about it is Bitcoin has plenty of its own characteristics to be bullish on, and any kind of large individual nation state buying is kind of a boost, a cherry on top. And it's always better to kind of have just low expectations, so that you're more likely to be surprised to the upside than the downside.
I like that approach. I try to apply that in life in general. uh, Ben, what's your take on the SBR and wherever else you want to comment on in this regard?
Yeah, I think Lyn nailed it in terms of the market's reaction to it right now, but I really loved the announcement. And I loved it for a couple of reasons. The first one is they created a really clear delineation between the two categories of assets. And I think that was really important. And there was a lot of uncertainty around how they were going to treat these, whether they were truly going to lump this all together as one crypto strategic reserve, or whether Bitcoin would really start to shine and highlight it as a true reserve asset that can be applied on a national level. And I think that was a really big step for them to take. The second one was, I don't think anybody was quite ready for that background section of the executive order where the United States government would be educating the world on the benefits of Bitcoin. That was one of my favorite parts about this entire executive order, was when they went in there and they made that connection to the world about it being digital gold. They highlighted the fixed supply, and they highlighted that Bitcoin can be treated as a strategic reserve asset. To me, that was beautiful because they're signaling this out globally. This isn't all of us Bitcoiners out on X telling everyone why Bitcoin's good. This was the United States government putting it in writing and putting it on the White House website. I think that's a massive, massive step. And it's going to force other countries to take stock in this. They're going to have to pay attention to what we're saying. I know that there's been some disappointment around this coming out as an executive order, because obviously executive orders can be reversed ultimately. But it's really, to me, it's what it signals. I mean, once the cat's out of the bag here and you've gone out and publicly told the world Bitcoin's the reserve asset, this is the only one that we're locking in a reserve that we are not selling. None of the other ones got that treatment. And that is a massive, massive step for Bitcoin. So where this progresses, we'll have to take some time to see, right? I think they've got 30 days to first go take inventory, which is kind of funny, right? Luckily, now they've got a on-chain verifiable asset. So once they get that in order, they won't ever have to take inventory again. But including the language about going out and coming up with budget neutral ways to acquire more Bitcoin is huge. And you're giving the two right guys the incentive to go do it. Right. I mean, Lutnick and Bassett, you can't ask for two better guys to go out and try to come up with these solutions. So when they say shall, right, that means they have to do this. They have to come up with the strategies. It doesn't mean they get implemented, obviously. That's going to take some time. But just the fact that they're going to be able to go out and do these assessments is massive. So I was very, very excited to see that announcement come out. It really raises my confidence in where Bitcoin's going. I think it's going to take the markets some time to digest exactly what this means. But ultimately, I see this as being nothing but positive for the asset.
100%.
Beautiful. Brandon.
Two quick comments here. One, yeah, agree. Very happy. Best case scenario. And based on the tweets on Sunday mentioning Cardona, Ripple,
I love that you call it
Solana.
Cardona, by the way. I think that's intentional.
Solano, whatever you call that. Based on that, I was not bullish on how this was going to look and when it was going to come out. So I think we dodged a bullet there. And then it brings up two questions in my mind. One, did they just hear all of us screaming Bitcoin, not crypto, separate them, and they just threw us a bone here? Or did they actually do the thinking and came up with the obvious right solution to separate the two? Don't know the answer. But either way, I think what's interesting here is the ability to do creative accounting to keep it budget neutral, in my opinion, sets the pretext for a nation state adoption war. I don't want to overstate that it's tomorrow or next month or maybe ever going to happen. But if it does happen, Trump likes to win. Trump likes to be number one. And so fancy accounting can come out of the woodwork at the last second to make sure we stay ahead in that race. And I like that conditions for Bitcoin's price, of course.
All right, John, we got to hear from you on the big news of the day.
Yeah, no, I think you guys nailed it. So I'll be brief, but yeah, I think just having some perspective on this, putting the initial market price reaction aside, I think having some perspective on this to be a very historic, massive development in Bitcoin's history, no doubt, I think we'll be looking back at March 2025 and saying this was a big deal. And if you just look at some of the, hater bear takes out there, some of them are like, oh, there's no explicit new buying in this announcement where the US government strategically declared Bitcoin to be an asset they're going to hold for the long term. And they're kind of ignoring the fact that Lutnick Investment were tasked with figuring out how to do budget neutral purchases. When it's like you're admitting that the US government is now holding Bitcoin strategically. And the worst thing you can say is that, oh, well, in this announcement, they also didn't announce, $1 billion purchases. It's like, let's have some perspective here. If that's your critique, then, I think you're admitting that this is a pretty big deal.
100%. So, and so just responding to some of the stuff in the chat, the summit continues. It's not all broadcast, right? So there's a lot of conversation before and after. And in conversations with people in DC, I've talked with a number of people, and I need to be careful exactly on what I say, but suffice it to say, I can verify that the conversation around actually finding these budget neutral purchases is tangible. It is happening. It's not an afterthought. It's not a bone in the executive order. This is a real ongoing drive. So that's obviously very interesting and part of what could be an upside surprise from this. And then I liked what Ben said, and that was also my take the night that it happened, that I think your most bullish outcome, besides just the US deciding to plow a huge amount in, would actually be if this kicks off a first follower. I guess we kind of already have UAE, but now that this is out, now that there is an official document from the US government that says, hey, Treasury, hey, Commerce, let's go find ways to get more of this stuff. And it's a strategic asset. It's scarce. David Sachs was on an interview. He gave a great marketing pitch. He was on TV and he said, why do we have the strategic Bitcoin reserve? Because Bitcoin is scarce. It's verifiable. It is, he said kind of all these qualities we've spent years talking about. And that's why the US government has decided it's a reserve asset. So tremendous marketing.
And mentioned right in the executive order too.
Yeah. Really something to see. We come a long way in a decade plus.
Let's dive in a little bit into like how we could buy, what is a budget neutral source of funds, right? And also what are a budget neutral source of funds that would not require the legislative branch to approve the spending? What could the executive branch do on its own? There's a few buckets. One is forfeited assets, which is like DOJ seized assets from crimes, and that's redirectable by the Attorney General. Sale of government property, which is like GSA surplus sales, also usable under executive authority. The Exchange Stabilization Fund, which was talked about a bit on Twitter yesterday, and I made a meme that had Barron Trump whispering in his dad's ear saying, "Use the Exchange Stabilization Fund, father." So this is the big one. It's $93.7 billion one time. It's a treasury managed fund for dollar stabilization. And it could potentially be used for Bitcoin, but it might require legislative approval. It's unclear. So it could face legal challenges. Would love to dive in more on that if Ben or Lyn have anything more to say on that. Final one is the special drawing rights, which would be a $25 billion one-time IMF reserve assets managed by the Treasury. You could use it for Bitcoin. It's because they have a broad kind of mandate over it, but would likely also require legislative justification. They could attempt to, but again, would require some kind of like legal challenge, or would face a legal challenge likely. So those last two are larger sources of funds, but the legal sort of clarity is not there. I wouldn't put it past the administration to try though. So any comments on that, Lyn, on these sources of budget neutral funds, or any other sources that you could think of to throw on the table?
I think your list was pretty exhaustive. And there's other kind of wonky ones like gold revaluation that lets them kind of fill up the TGA. I think that's debatably not budget neutral because it does kind of result in debasement, unlike some of the others. But it is different than, say, issuing debt or using taxpayer funds directly for it. And I think that it kind of the main thing now is just uncertainty, right? Timing, the scale that they'll do it. During, right now when they're kind of focusing on these Doge cuts, they are trying to, for example, consolidate properties to some extent to say, hey, we have half empty buildings. Can we save taxpayer money by, kind of ending these building contracts or selling these properties and consolidating? And then, of course, one can debate, should that go back to the taxpayers or should that go to Bitcoin? And that kind of opens up a whole discussion. And so far at the moment, I think one of the key things that has already been touched on here is that it's just really good advertising. That basically that the United States government, the president, other people high up in the administration are talking about the benefits of Bitcoin and how it's different than crypto. And I think that's very positive. And I think if you're a nation state out there and you're not already kind of front running this a little bit, it's like, what are you even doing? Like, there's like 200 countries out there. It's like, why is there like 3 that are kind of like publicly known to have some, whatever the number is? And it's like they're basically just telling you right there that it's now endorsed by the one of the 2 biggest countries in the world. And so I think that's kind of how I look at it. I'd like to see actually more things from the government. Like, everyone's kind of focused on the strategic Bitcoin reserve because it is the most impactful for price compared to other things that the government could do. But I like to give a shout out to other things they could do. They could, for example, make the first $5,000 in like capital gains on Bitcoin per year tax free, which alleviates like accounting issues for people that want to spend it on small amounts without really affecting the way that they get revenue from maybe large traders and things like that. So I think there are kind of like low key things that are quality of life things they could be doing that are good for the asset. Whereas obviously this one gets a lot of headlines because price. When is it going to moon? And so of course that's that's kind of what always captures attention.
Yeah. I think like, so question for you there. any of those tax changes, that'll be a Congress thing though, right? Or is there any executive ability to do some of those like tax benefits?
I'm not a legal expert, but my understanding is that it would require Congress to do kind of to exclude or partially exclude an asset. But they can still lobby for it. I mean, they can push for it. They have, their party is in control, and obviously
Sure.
Trump has a lot of influence on the party, and that probably wouldn't be a core controversial thing, other than the fact that it's not really on most Congress people's like radar. That's not something they really wake up and decide to care about, but it's something that doesn't really hurt anyone. It's got really low impact financially either way. But then there are people that would really benefit from something like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think they're going to have to look at path of least resistance first as well when they do this, right? The normal solution when you're going to dive into this and try to find ways to go and acquire another asset is not going to be to reinvent things in a big way. They're going to try to do it with as little friction as possible. And to me, that means going through all the different categories of reserves that the United States is holding today and seeing how you might want to rebalance those reserves. If Bitcoin becomes something, if you truly want the digital capital of the future and you want to start accumulating a position that keeps the United States in a position of power by participating in Bitcoin to a scale that they participate in the rest of the global economy, I think that they're going to need to look for ways that are fairly simple. Like the first things you could look at is look at how much gold we have. Now, obviously, we need to see if that audit's going to happen to find out what's actually there. But I think that's valued somewhere around $740 billion today. So could you carve off $10 billion out of that and have $730 billion of gold, add $10 billion to Bitcoin? You could look at your foreign currency reserves. I think we're somewhere under $27 billion in foreign currency reserves. And so there might be an allocation that could come out of that. Maybe $1 billion out of that reserve ends up going into Bitcoin. And then anything they're going to do tax related, I think they would have to really structure that in a way where it feels very friendly to the US taxpayer. I think that there are kind ways to accumulate Bitcoin using the US taxpayer. That could be things on incentives in terms of paying tax, a portion of your tax in Bitcoin, where maybe they can provide you with some type of an incentive at a lower tax rate if you provide it, if they've got an active accumulation strategy at the time. But I think any of the tax measures that are going to come into place around cutting the capital gains or any of those measures are just going to take some time. In terms of looking at this on a global level, there was already an interest that was spinning up out there around Bitcoin. As soon as Russia got cut off from the SWIFT network, this got highlighted to every country in the world. You can't watch that happen as the leader of a nation and not start to think, what if this happens to me? If I'm getting really dependent on the US dollar and the rails that the US dollar works on, it's in the best interest of my nation to find a way to at least reserve something that keeps me sovereign, that could keep open the trade paths with other nations. If I get cut off from the US dollar, I still need a way that I could potentially settle trade. And there's really only one asset out there that has scale, that's decentralized with no central issuer, where they can't shut you down from that. And that one is Bitcoin. So to me, part of the reason this is becoming so big at the moment is because I think that seed had already been planted for most of these nations. And what the US just did was legitimize the asset that they were thinking about. It almost takes off any of the barriers to go and make this move for your country. And I think it almost becomes negligent not to at this point. I think you have to evaluate this just because of what you've seen. And once it happens once, there's no guarantee that it doesn't happen again. So the US opening this reserve and saying that they're even evaluating accumulating more of this says to me, if I'm another country, I better start doing the same thing. I'm going to start looking at making sure that I'm accumulating so that the US doesn't get out in front of me and do their accumulation strategy before I can reach the proportionate amount that I want to hold in my own reserves.
I would actually add to that point real quick is that when we see in the BRICS nations, they have been for a while exploring all of these like other potential like transaction methods, cross-border payments and settlements that are not censorable by any one country, and they've had a lot of frictions with that. It kind of shows the challenge of trying to agree on like this closed source consortium type of thing. So the BIS was like Enbridge, I think it's called, and there's a number of central banks that were participating in that. And there's like BRICS Bank, and basically these various ways to try to make that work outside of the dollar system. And they have this open source, freely accessible thing that's already working. And one of the friction points, I think, for a lot of them is, I mean, one is just maybe lack of understanding or like not having done the time on it. And two is like, even if someone gets it, there's always career risk. You add Bitcoin to your reserves and then it goes through a period of downward volatility. And one of the challenges is that they kind of have to have Bitcoin to make use of that, because if they only want to say buy Bitcoin to use its transactional properties after they've been censored, that gets harder, especially if there's like a big amount of censoring happen. So they have to kind of pre-own it if they're going to get the core benefits, but then they go along for that volatility ride. So then they have to position it accordingly so that they don't get like public backlash or career risk and things like that. But I just find that we kind of have it staring us in the face, a problem that dozens of countries are like literally saying, we want to have this thing, we want to have X dollar settlement mechanisms, and yet strategically there is this asset that does exactly that.
It's the role of other countries and what does the rest of the world do in response to this is one of the most interesting and exciting parts of it, because it is a starting gun in some capacity that says, hey, if you're another country and you've been looking at this, like, we're getting involved in a new way, there may be purchases coming, and so like, if you were interested in it, the time to announce and to move is now. And we may get countries start to do it, or we may discover that countries have already started to do it and haven't announced in some capacities. I'm not saying that's my base case, but there is a possibility that, people just kept this quiet. So that's one of the most interesting parts for me.
One of the things I'm most interested to follow is how public the if nation state adoption does go on at whatever pace it does, how public will the acquisition process be? And you're never really going to know the full answer, right? Because you'll never know that some country out there is acquiring and not telling us. But I just want that, what the reasons that we all love Bitcoin, it's a long list, right? But the game theory and the incentives of it is a huge part of it. And nation state adoption, hits that right on the head. So I just wonder, will it be transparent and the governments, and it'll be like an El Salvador type thing, and they're just fully transparent, this is kind of our ethos, this is how much Bitcoin we have, this is how much we're accumulating? But will other countries take a totally different tact and accumulate under the radar? Maybe eventually they'll publicize it, but will they build their position and then one day, a year or two down the road, be like, oh, by the way, we have 250,000 Bitcoin now? That'll be fun to watch in the coming years.
I have to assume the Western aligned countries will be public, showing support. We're all in it together, rah, rah, Bitcoin. But competitor nations, I think, have an incentive to secretly leapfrog us in their holdings, right?
That's probably fair.
What you're telling me is put 5% of your national reserves in Bitcoin and you get a tariff discount.
Art of the deal.
I also like Don Bay's calculations. He's kind of looking at sovereign wealth funds, and you see things like how much wealth is in the sovereign wealth fund per citizen, right? So you can have a SATs per citizen metric coming out here. I think that's a pretty interesting way to look at this, because the US has a lot of Bitcoin, but per citizen, not as much as the country of Bhutan. Better check my math on that, but
wouldn't surprise me at all.
It's a beautiful map.
Yeah, very good.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Bhutan is holding strategically. I know the way they talk about their Bitcoin reserves, and most of that's through mining. I don't know about the how the countries, the rest of these countries got their Bitcoin. I'm assuming it's probably similar to the way the United States has gotten their Bitcoin, our Bitcoin. Does anyone know of another legal strategic Bitcoin reserve? This is the first, yes?
I think in like an official, like, unless you count El Salvador in some capacity, this is the first like formalized one.
I would count El Salvador.
And you could, yeah.
And Bhutan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, this is obviously like, I don't know, it's different. It's different when the US does it. And it's a different, I don't know if El Salvador ever had like a formal document outlining, this is our strategic reserve, this is what we're doing. I think they started just buying Bitcoin, which is fine.
Yeah.
but I could be wrong there.
Good enough, in my opinion, to qualify.
I agree.
I think the other thing that's important here is that on the other coins that they were talking about, I think that they got that right. And I think that there were some ethical questions that come in around a few of those. Because, for instance, if you look at Ripple, I think it blew a lot of people's minds when Trump tweeted out that XRP was going to be a part of the crypto strategic reserve when he mentioned that. And alarm bells were going off all over the place. Because if they were to do that, you're essentially bolstering the capital position of a private entity. And you have to look at why would that possibly be strategic to the United States, right? If you're talking strategic reserves, you have to be able to defend why the asset is strategic to be held. And when you've got the issuer being Ripple Labs, who's only a seller of the XRP token, it's basically a way for them to raise capital at will. Including that into any type of a reserve just raises a lot of ethical questions around this because it is so concentrated on one issuer. And then you've got the other ones as well, right? Look at everything that's happened in the past with Ethereum and the number of times that they've changed the economics around the token issuances of Ethereum. It's very hard to make the case for anything like that it should be strategic to a nation. People might start to argue about the tokenization of assets, and so should the U.S. have some way to participate in that economy if it's going to be largely grown within the United States borders. That's probably where some of those arguments would come from. But only one of them really makes a simple, clear case for being strategic. And when it has to do with being able to send value around the world with no intermediary, that you can absolutely see as a strategic asset that the United States should have a stake in, right? When the US dollar is the current reserve, you've got to evaluate the long-term trajectory here. Reserve currencies have come and gone. I mean, Lyn's done some really amazing work around this, so she might have an interesting view on this. But you can't assume that innovation is going to stop and you're going to be the reserve currency in the world forever. So when new technologies come out and new assets come out that can start to fill that type of a role, if you are the leading country with the leading strategic reserve currency or, reserve, you have to evaluate whether or not this new emerging asset could potentially be a threat to you. And if it is, strategically, you should probably be participating in owning some portion of that asset, if it's even just to protect your current standing in the world. So I think that making the case for that to be strategic and then separating out the other ones, it made me optimistic that they do understand what they're looking at and they're not fully just falling to lobbying efforts in terms of what coins get involved here, because this is a really big deal when you make this type of announcement. You can't just throw something out there and allow it to be. You have to put some critical thought into each of the assets that you're going to include in something like this and be able to defend why it's a strategic interest for the country to have them.
And Ben, Peter Schiff agrees with you.
Man.
Let's just hit on that for a second. Like, how crazy was it to see these people who are either not fans of Bitcoin like Peter Schiff, or the people who are fans of a litany of different altcoins coming out and saying, you know what, if the US government is going to have a reserve, it only makes sense to be Bitcoin only. I'm not sure if that was an intentional place that the powers that be in the government wanted to end up in terms of where the dialogue and the narrative went, but that's where it went. That was a very nice, welcome development in my view the past week.
See, I think Peter's one of the great marketing minds out there. I mean, he's willing to double and triple down on something like nobody I've ever seen before. And what this showed is all he needed was another asset to rally against that he goes, well, I can at least understand Bitcoin. And I could even understand why people look at it as digital gold. But these other things, that was all he needed to come back to Team Bitcoin. So he understands it more than people want to give him credit for. But he's created his entire marketing journey around, not understanding it since like $10 or wherever he started talking about it.
It's the Lord of the Rings meme of I never thought I'd find myself fighting side by side with an elf. That's Peter here. And, it's something I was reminded that I think this also provides an interesting, there's a lot of these state level SBR proposals, and I've been hesitant on a lot of them. I'm in Florida. I know the people working on the bill, that one has seemed as quite likely, or at least one should take it seriously. The potential incoming governor has formally supported it. There's a lot of support. Texas also seems like a pretty serious bill. But now that the US has done this on a federal level, I'm wondering how the probabilities on those state level bills, like, I mean, they go up for sure. To where, I don't know. But it's a more interesting, I think, landscape there where, I mean, if the federal government has already done it and you guys want to do it, I think for at least like the Congress people, the Senate people in the states that are looking at this as like, oh, this is crazy. I mean, it gets substantially.
Yeah, it gives you a lot of cover for sure.
A lot of cover.
And it has passed in the Texas Senate, needs to pass in their House of Representatives. The governor has said he would sign it. And yes, there's a lot of cover. It looks like the House will probably, the make of the House will support it. It is a Republican majority. So we'll probably get an SBR in Texas, which is the 8th largest economy on the planet.
It'll be interesting to see. I mean, you start getting a machine moving.
Yeah. I remember a month or two ago, a couple months ago after the election, we were talking about the strategic reserve, and you and I were just completely euphoric, high, bullish about this thing and how it was going to spark this, this race to accumulate Bitcoin, and we're going to transition officially into, not officially, but it'll transition us into the suddenly phase, hit that asymptote, and it's just off from here. I still feel like that, even though there's been this like paltry response immediately to it. Yeah. But I think, this is just such an incredibly huge signal to the entire world and validation of Bitcoin, to every company on the planet, to every nation on the planet, to every individual on the planet, that obviously it will have a profound effect on Bitcoin's perception around the world and adoption, in my opinion.
I do wonder if at the state level, if it's going to open them up to be more open about creating Bitcoin only reserves. You've seen a lot of the language that's been coming out in the states where they're really softening that to keep it really broad. I do wonder if this happening at the federal level and them calling out specifically a Bitcoin strategic reserve makes that the most palatable path forward for the states to pursue. So I'll be curious to see any new legislation that starts coming out at the state level to see if they make that pivot and now they really start doubling down on the Bitcoin only from a reserve perspective.
Yep. It was very specifically a Bitcoin, not crypto executive order. It said we are going to look into accumulating more Bitcoin, and we are not going to look into accumulating more not Bitcoin. So apparently, and Steven sent me this. I'll show this real quick, Steven.
Yeah. This is great. This just frames the whole thing. So this is going to be a look at the actual U.S. government holdings of other cryptos. What you'll see, so you got, we'll call it $20 billion of Bitcoin. You've got 175 million of ETH, which, okay, there's a little bit of ETH. You got 120 in USDT, which is just, US treasuries. That's dollars. You then have 79 million in wrapped Bitcoin. So that's more Bitcoin. And then the biggest altcoin position they have is 27 million in BNB. And then some more dollar stable coins, then wrapped ETH, then another stable coin. $4 million is the largest that we're aware of, like true altcoin, we'll call it, that's a Uniswap and down. So, like I said, these are tiny numbers.
And those are from confiscations and criminal cases, et cetera.
Correct.
Yeah.
So it's not much.
Well, I said before we started the call that we should try to just spend like 10 or 15 minutes on SBR so that we can get into some other topics. And here we are 40 minutes later. So that's okay. I do want to get into some non-SBR stuff with Lyn and Ben here. Ben obviously is a specialist in LBEs and Bitcoin treasuries. So I think we should get into that for a little bit. And Lyn, we've got, there's lots that we can talk about in macro world. Would love to just what are you interested in right now? We've got tariffs, we've got the bond bloodbaths in the EU, we've got El Salvador versus the IMF, all kinds of stuff happening right now. What's something that you're watching that maybe you haven't shared publicly yet?
Well, I think the biggest thing I'm watching that I have been public about is just watching the tariffs. I've come on the record that I think that the tariffs are bigger and potentially more uncertain news than Doge. I tend to take the under on how aggressively Doge is going to be able to cut government spending, apart from a ton of small optical wins that, they do add up. But when we're talking about a $2 trillion deficit, I think that's probably not going to be as impactful as people think. But the tariffs, I think, are really big uncertainty factor for asset classes across the board. The Europe bond issue is interesting because they have historically been pretty reticent to turn to fiscal. My whole kind of like fiscal dominance theme, it largely applies to the United States. I mean, there are other countries that have a similar dynamic, but in the developed world, partially because of the way Europe's structured, they've not been very fiscally focused as much as say the United States has and certain other countries, and they kind of woke up a little bit to go that approach for better or worse. And so that's a potentially more inflationary approach. It's a bond supply issue potentially. And so it is kind of interesting to see them join us a little bit potentially in kind of the fiscal dominance arena.
And so something notable in the traditional markets is so the U.S. equities have gotten kind of hammered under an administration that has been very vocal many times that they are not paying attention to the stock market right now. They're letting that come down. But European equities and Chinese equities have done phenomenally. I think they're both up like double digits in the last 2 months. U.S. assets have gotten sold. The dollar is down substantially, and there's been this surprising and incredible bid in foreign assets. Do you have any thoughts on the performance that we've seen in those markets?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is just they were very underowned as far as kind of most portfolio constructions. If you look at like the U.S. market cap relative to like all other market caps in the world, it's like it was like comically like everybody was on one side of the boat. Global capital stuffed into U.S. markets, Americans are stuffed into their own markets, and so it only takes a fairly small change to kind of move over. And A weaker dollar always helps. It's interesting because the election and then some of the initial tariff talk was kind of dollar strengthening. But since then, it's come off that, which alleviates a lot of the pressure and liquidity from those things. And if you look at, so Trump has a nominee for his like the chair of his Council of Economic Advisors, Stephen Miran. And he's the one that co-authored the paper with Nouriel Roubini maybe a year ago about activist treasury issuance. But also he did a paper on his own in November 2024, so right after Trump was elected, and it kind of walked through realigning global trade. It's kind of the stuff that like I've been writing about, and like Luke Gromen writes about. It's kind of like that, and so it's interesting to see it from the an economist that is very much in Trump's ear and endorsed by Trump. And one of the things that the paper does spell out is that initially some of these policies are probably dollar strengthening, but then on the back half, they kind of describe it as being more like you know evaluating other currencies kind of the way that they should be more valued on a trade weighted basis. Basically, say that it's dollar weakening in the back half, and I don't think we're necessarily on that back half yet. But it is interesting that kind of behind all of the tariff talk, the kind of the chaotic headlines that can come up, there is this kind of intellectual rigor. It's in at least part of the administration that says, okay, this is our potential game plan. This is how we could align global trade. This is, this is why it's happening. This is potentially how to fix it. And then here's the risks of some of those ways to fix it. Like, can we pull this off or not? And what are the trade-offs? And so, um, I think it's interesting that they are kind of maybe going through that map, that approach to some extent. You kind of have that already laid out. We don't know to what extent they're going to keep following it, but there is a little bit of things you can read to be a little bit less surprised by some of the things that maybe we're seeing.
Absolutely. And I've read that report that he did, and I had the same reaction as you. It was pretty incredible to see somebody coming into kind of formal political office writing those sorts of things. And I mean, that's helped me. I mean, for viewers, I do recommend reading this because, one of the takes that's been flying around is like, oh, it's just like chaos. There's no plan. But you read this report, and I think it helps lay out what they're attempting to do, right? We don't know if it's going to be successful. We don't know how it's going to go, but it does seem like that is the plan.
And Lyn, I have a question for you. So one of this kind of, maybe this is a left curve take, but I feel like in general, Trump is someone who does not want to see the market be down on an extended period of time, I believe there's some magnitude, some duration where he and the people around him would say, okay, guys, this is getting tough, to sell to our constituents, to explain to people. One of the reasons we're all into Bitcoin is because we've recognized that people use the stock market and their homes as a savings vehicle. We generally think that is a bad thing, but that is the system we're in now. I think it becomes difficult over some time horizon for Trump to say to people, hey, your stocks are down big. Maybe real estate is lagging or down. I know that's painful for you, but I swear I'm doing good policy moves for you. I think there's some duration where that becomes a difficult message. I don't think we're there at all right now. He just got sworn in a month and a half ago. If anything, this is the prime time for him to do this. If his poll numbers drop a little bit, that's okay. Midterms are far away. How are you thinking about the magnitude and duration of, let's just say, a U.S. equity market sell-off that would get Trump and Bessent saying, hey, guys, we're in a little dangerous territory here for our administration?
Well, I was going to say the same thing that you were touching on there when you were kind of talking about that, which is to say that if they're going to do it, this is the time to do it. I mean, I would say that they basically have all year before maybe that would be like a deafening issue. That doesn't mean they couldn't decide that it's a pain point earlier. Um, but I think until you really start focusing on kind of midterm campaigning and kind of get that in focus, I think they have a lot of leeway here. And I think they're going to use it. Trump has presidents are always focused on the stock market and overall kind of perception of asset prices doing decently. Trump is historically been even more so focused on the stock market. I think that will return in time, but I think that because they're kind of coming in harder in this administration than they did the prior one. His prior administration had a mix of kind of establishment types and some anti-establishment types, and over time there's a lot of turmoil and rotation in the administration. But this time it's been a more aligned group coming in, more of like an anti-establishment group hitting the ground harder, shock and awe, doing a lot of big things. And of course, that's generally going to be disruptive for asset prices because it's all everyone's certainty level is down, at least over the next 12 months or so. And I think that they, I'm not a mind reader, but I think they have kind of this year to do what they're going to do before they have to start worrying too much about that.
And if there were a sell-off, which could obviously happen for a long list of reasons, but let's say a material equity sell-off, I don't know what, just to put some numbers around it, more than 10% for months on end or 10% very quickly. What do you think would be their primary levers that they would try to pull to support the markets in some way, shape, or form?
So one would be any sort of dollar negative thing, like it was discussed in the Stephen Mirren report. So generally speaking, a weaker dollar is good for global liquidity and therefore asset prices. Other levers are just basically to tone down some of the things that they like the tariffs, for example, to say, okay, we have more clarity here. We're happy with our tariff approach. This is what we're going to do. And maybe we'll ratchet up over time or something like that. Basically a little bit less kind of headline risk than investors keep running into where, they think certain things playing out and then it's like, oh, these tariffs are back on the table and they're off again, they're on again. They could decide to reduce the impact there. They also can focus on tax changes. Generally speaking, there are ways to stimulate not just through spending, but by in some sense reducing revenue. That's like another lever that they can choose to pull. The prior administration, they passed a pretty big tax cut, and it resulted, for example, in capital repatriation. So companies around the world had kind of global capital, and then they pulled it back to the U.S. And then a lot of times they used it to buy back shares, which was good for the stock market. Now they don't really have that same kind of pool of cash, but overall, any of those things that are kind of pro bottom line and less disruptive, they could decide to pivot to more of those once they get past this kind of earlier pain point.
John, on your question, there was a great quote from Bessent on TV. They asked him, is there a Trump put on the stock market, which was a term. It basically means like if it gets to this point, like they'll sort it out for the audience. And Bessent goes, no, there's not a Trump put, but there is a Trump call. And so I thought that was pretty funny. And I think it's like they're willing to have it come down, but it's going up later. It will go higher. It's just they want to have it come down first.
And I think, I think I saw the same thing. And he made some reference to, if we enact good policies, the market will go up. So he's still like, it still is part of their scorecard. They can't remove that from the scorecard. I think it's more just like a timing thing, and how serious are they about these reforms? And that's what will play out over the coming years.
Yeah, and they bought themselves time early as well, right? Because I think they said that they don't truly own this economy until 6 to 12 months.
Yeah.
So it basically gave them air cover to run around, move fast. You know that the markets were going to turn volatile during that, because when you get statements like that coming out of an administration, you have no certainty in the market. So early on, obviously, you were going to see some capital rotation out of the US markets was going to happen. But them signaling the timeline tells you that the first half of the year, they're going to be trying to enact as many things as they can that they think are going to set themselves up for the following 18 months to try to get back on track. And Trump has historically been very heavy on using the stock market as his barometer for success. And I don't think that's going to change. He's always, aligned himself to financial success. It's been his metric his entire life. And I don't see that changing now. But I think they were pretty transparent, and the market believed them when they said it. In 6 to 12 months, it's going to take us some time to get everything in order, get aligned on the path we're going to go, and then you're going to see the results later on in the administration. So expect volatility is kind of where I've been at. The market's going to react pretty sharply in both directions to any of the news, because at this point, it's basically sitting there waiting for uncertainty to materialize in any type of announcement. So I think you're going to see a lot of those overreactions happening both directions for at least the first half of the year.
Another challenge that they face is that Trump in this administration is entering with higher equity valuations than the prior time. Not just in terms of like what the S&P 500 is, but like say price to earnings multiples and other metrics like that. So they're starting with a position that's it's kind of takes more effort to kind of keep it elevated or keep climbing. And so this might be a way of kind of setting expectations to say, maybe don't expect the first year to be anything like the prior year, because it's already somewhat frothy. I keep using Costco as an example, where they were trading at like 60 times earnings for like a 45-year-old blue chip company, or however old they are, and it's like, and you see that a lot in the market. That just there's pockets of froth out there. It's not just the big seven tech names. It's other kind of growth oriented, high quality, large cap equities in general, a little bit frothy. So and I think they see that.
All right, Ben, I think there's plenty of viewers who want to hear about MSTR and leverage Bitcoin equities in general. What's the state now? Is the sort of scare of MicroStrategy's drop over? Is it moving back up to new all-time highs? What do you think happens this year?
Yeah, it's going to be a very interesting story to follow, which is why I spend so much of my time doing it. I think that the market correctly identified that they'd gotten very delevered. And part of that, I think, was intentional in Q4 of last year. Everyone got kind of shell-shocked by the speed that they started moving through the 21-21 plan, which was 21 billion of equity and 21 billion of fixed income products. Yep. And early on, people were really cheering for that because they saw the demand that was out there. The market was chewing up all the equity that they were selling via the ATM. But then it did hurt retail sentiment in a big way after a while. I think after they got through a few weeks and all of a sudden you're through $10 billion of ATM, the market started to respond less favorably to that. And I'm not sure that they saw exactly what was happening. And that's all a part of the engineering that goes on with leveraged Bitcoin equities, because what you're essentially doing is you're managing your leverage ratios around the fair market value of the Bitcoin that's on your balance sheet. And so when they're using the ATM, they're basically moving unencumbered Bitcoin, right? Non-debt related Bitcoin onto the balance sheet, which increases that fair market value on the balance sheet that you're holding. And that creates space for you to go out and do additional offerings with the other side of the plan through convertible bond offerings, or we saw them do a preferred stock offering. But a part of them generating this Bitcoin yield and signaling to the market that they've got a growth rate out here that the market can rely on in terms of how much Bitcoin per share they're going to be able to accrete to the shareholders, relies on them going to the other side as well. That's where they get the most accretive transactions, is through those convertible bond offerings or through the preferred stock offerings. So they're in a position right now where they're still under-levered compared to where they want to be. They'd gotten all the way down to, I think they were at just above 12% from a leverage ratio. Now they've climbed back up to about 19%, but that's still below their target range. So they want to get back into the 20 to 30% is the range that they're trying to stay in. And that means that there's going to be more fixed income offerings coming. I'm going to be a little surprised if volatility holds up the way that it has. Bitcoin volatility has been climbing back up. It was down below 50 not too long ago. It's back up around 60 right now, which brought MicroStrategy back up to around 100. If that volatility holds, they're going to be able to go out and get more favorable terms on the convertible bonds, the premium that everybody's looking for. If you've got low volatility, that premium compresses, which is why I think you saw them at a 35% premium on the last offering. But if the volatility stays high, I think they're going to be out getting more favorable terms on their convertible bonds again. And I do think that there's several reasons why they want to issue them in Q1, mostly being that if you're looking at this strategically and you're trying to align it to the Bitcoin cycles, there's a clause that happens within all these convertible bond offerings where if the stock trades at 130% of the conversion price for 20 out of 30 days during a quarter, they become eligible for early conversion by the holders. They can get out of them, convert to equity. And if you look at the timing, there's a 1 month or a 1 quarter lag that happens before that provision becomes effective. So if they get the bonds issued in Q1, that means that Q2 is kind of a dead quarter for them. But in Q3, where you would expect that peak in a traditional Bitcoin cycle, it gives them that opportunity to essentially come to the end of a 4-year cycle. It could be extended. Obviously, we could discuss what we think on that, but it gives them the opportunity to opportunistically become more delevered going into a potential blow off top. So there is some strategy involved with getting these out the door early and giving themselves the benefit of that timing and putting themselves in a really strong position exiting 2025, going into 2026, to have a lot of flexibility to operate. But what you saw happen with MicroStrategy when they got delevered was you saw that multiple to net asset value compress. People really started hyper-focusing on the multiple to net asset value. It's kind of become the top metric that people are following. And that's largely, I view it in 2 ways. One, it's a sentiment indicator around what Bitcoin's doing, right? You'll see that fluctuate wildly depending on where the optimism is around Bitcoin. But the second one is about the leverage that they're applying to their balance sheet, the volatility that they're achieving with the stock, and where they're at in being able to generate additional Bitcoin yield through taking on these different capital markets transactions. So now that they're getting more levered, you're starting to see that multiple climb back up again. Bitcoin got some relief. The volatility came back to Bitcoin. You're starting to see that multiple to net asset value climb back up. I think it's around 2 again, maybe just under 2 right now. But I think as they continue to do these transactions, you'll see that start to expand again. And as we see Bitcoin start to move, that's what really amplifies it. So there's a lot of really good things coming for MSTR, but I think that the strategic Bitcoin reserve actually opens the doors for a lot of treasury strategies to be announced. Bitcoin has the scale that's going to make it the story that stays in front of everybody. But the fact that this opened it up as an option to so many companies that may be sitting on the sidelines going, we don't quite know how the administration's going to look at this. Maybe it's too risky for us to evaluate as a corporation. That's gone now. And so I think that you're going to start seeing the emergence of just treasury strategies, right? Just converting some of the cash in your treasury to Bitcoin. I think that's a very safe play now. But I also think it'll open the door for more companies to expand standing up their treasury as an active value creation vertical versus more of a passive organization where they can actually go generate value for the shareholders through it. So I think that that's going to be evaluated much more closely than people would have had something like this not occurred.
Yeah.
Good stuff. We are at time. Do you guys have 5 more minutes?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Lyn, I've got one for you. This is sort of, out of the macro, but I think it's something that you'll be interested in. I'd love to hear your take. So, Bitcoin's sort of culture and ethos kind of has its roots in cypherpunk culture. And that has persisted for quite some time. I feel like there's been an inflection point in Bitcoin culture over the past year or two, especially with ETFs a year ago. Now we've got nation state adoption on the biggest level on the planet, and it's sort of out of the hands of these early adopters who've been around since the very early days, even sort of the 2015, 2016, 2017 period, where I think that culture was still largely intact and carried forth. We have a bunch of Bitcoiners, leaving Bitcoin Twitter, going to Nostr. And, meanwhile, this global financial system adoption is happening. How is this affecting Bitcoin culture? What's the future for all of us Bitcoiners? And will this lead to I don't know, maybe Bitcoin being treated more for profit, less on principle, etc.? You know what I'm trying to say? Like, what does this happen with this development where it's being adopted in the highest levels of the financial world?
There are a lot of movements that kind of go through these growing pains where the early ones are really kind of more hardcore or ideological in a sense. And then as you get to become a very big movement, that gets diluted to some extent. I think there's an inevitability to it. You're not going to have billions of like hardcore cypherpunks in the world, as cool as
Yeah.
that would be. And so I think it's natural that it shifts toward a more financial conversation. I think what remains relevant though is you can still grow the pie. I mean, if Bitcoin, for example, gets 10 or 100 times bigger than it was any given like year in the past, you could say, well, maybe cypherpunks are a smaller percentage now, but you can still grow the absolute number of people that are building on Bitcoin, that are interested in those kind of freedom aspects to it, and that are putting it to that use. I mean, part of the reason I'm active in venture in Bitcoin is to keep supporting people that want to do interesting things with Bitcoin aside from just hold it. That want to build out better payment rails and use it as a truth server. Like the immutability aspect to say this thing was indeed stamped into it at this time and we can prove it. That kind of stuff. And I think that's still relevant. And I think there are a lot of really good people still working on that. One of the narratives that some bears like to use, I mean, some people in the Bitcoin community kind of point this out, but there are also people external to it to say Bitcoin is quote unquote captured now because
Yeah.
everybody's focused on number go up and nation states, and I think that's kind of missing the forest for the trees because this wasn't a decision by Bitcoin to be purchased. It's a decision by the fiat system to recognize its benefits and to start buying it. And part of what makes some of those other elements strong is when you have a much larger and then potentially less volatile Bitcoin. By being a fairly small asset that not a lot of people understood or own, that limits its transaction potential because fewer people want to accept it. Even if they do accept it, they have to deal with the volatility of it compared to something like the dollar or stable coins that they kind of fill that role. And I think as more and more entities hold Bitcoin, and just as a normal course of operation, the network becomes bigger, more liquid, in time, I would argue less volatile, and that's indirectly good for some of those more cypherpunk things. It's better when the currency is not fluctuating around by like 80%, and having these massive drawdown stuff. Obviously, be like upward volatility, but eventually, when you get to a certain scale, both sides of volatility should hopefully decrease, and that's a good thing for those other purposes.
Yeah, I feel like you have to build, and this has happened. I think you have to build the principles into the protocol, right? So that no matter what happens with the adoption, they're there. They are there. Self sovereignty, for instance, decentralization, etc. So they cannot be compromised. And yeah, you're right. I think a movement like this, sort of, once there's mass adoption and the goal of spreading Bitcoin around the world and making it a global money has been achieved, then it just becomes part of documentaries. And you hang out with each other maybe once a year or something.
Well, I think it's a part of the beauty of having a creator that walks away, right? I mean, once you release an asset like this out to the world, you give up the control of what it's going to be. The world's going to decide how it best gets utilized and ingrained in it. And I think that's a pretty beautiful thing about Bitcoin, that it was truly just released, walked away, gave up control, and now the world gets to decide how to best utilize the asset in the network.
It really is a pretty astonishing act of philanthropy and selflessness.
Brady, I love your question that you posed to Lyn. If I could just add one thing to it, I kind of put the people who are upset with the path of Bitcoin in two camps. If the people who are just like, hey, all these people are adopting Bitcoin and they're not cypherpunks and they don't know anything about computer science and they weren't around in the early days, my response to that is like, you got to deal with it. If the other people who if they have a critique that says, hey, the institutionalization of Bitcoin is going to lead to Bitcoin not being able to do its core functions, allowing people to protect themselves from inflation and censorship, then I'm all ears. I'm like, if you have a good argument for why this is going to make us head down a bad path, then we should all be listening to that. So I kind of bucket people in those two big groups when they start saying they don't like the institutionalization of Bitcoin.
I like that.
And it's also, what did you think was going to happen? Like, was there another path where Bitcoin succeeded and became globally relevant, where it didn't pass through institutional adoption and states? And I mean, this is what success looks like. Not that you have to say like Bitcoin winning looks like the US government buying it, like as the end goal. But the US government buying Bitcoin is evidence that it's winning, and it was always going to pass through these stages. There was no alternative. It's just something we have to navigate, and hopefully we have the right culture around the asset and the right technology that we're able to navigate this without losing what makes Bitcoin special.
It's better to have allies than enemies.
Absolutely.
Yeah, all the screeching is easily defined by just human nature. We are little mimetic creatures. We're still tribal in our emotions, and that's just being played out here for the millionth time in another subculture. Safe to just discard those opinions. I agree. But I think the reality here, tying it back to Lyn's point, is Bitcoin is still a Trojan horse for freedom. Okay, the megaphone's larger, more people are coming in. And yeah, of course, they're coming for the gains, and financialization is taking center stage right now. But it doesn't mean that we can't, as Bitcoiners, spread freedom with all these new folks coming in who are paying attention to it. So that is our mission, to spread the cypherpunk pie through the whole process. I don't want to see 50 years from now, Bitcoin gets absorbed by the machine. We forget all these values and it sort of gets neutered, right? And Satoshi even had a quote on that. It's an arms race against the state for freedom for individuals. And maybe it just buys us some time. I still think the biggest risk for Bitcoin is we sort of just give up the fight at some point because, number went up high enough and our grandkids don't remember what we went through.
It's a beautiful place to end it. Thanks so much, everyone. Appreciate your time. Lyn and Ben did put together a piece on digital asset reserves, which you can check out in the Swan blog at swan.com/signal. You'll see it right up there at the top. Digital asset reserves, Bitcoin stands alone. Some good data in here, and looks at considering this is the answer to why did Trump sign an executive order that is Bitcoin, not crypto. And here's all the data. There's some other great analysis in there as well, so you can check that out. And John requested that we end on this clip, so I'm going to see if we can make that work.
This should give everyone some good perspective on the big event of yesterday.
All right.
You think we'll be talking about Bitcoin in 10 years from now?
I won't be talking about Bitcoin in 10 years. I can assure you that.
But you might be in at least 6 years as Treasury Secretary, as you just said.
Exactly. I would bet even in 5 or 6 years, I'm no longer talking about Bitcoin as Treasury Secretary. I'll have other priorities.
You'll be loaded up on Bitcoin and a gazillionaire.
I can assure you I will personally not be loaded up on Bitcoin.
Never say never.
That's
Chad
amazing.
Kernan is the best. Absolutely.
Yeah, he really is. He does a great job.
Turns out the Treasury Secretary is talking about Bitcoin 10 years later.
That's right. All right. We'll see you next week for another edition of the show. 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern. We'll be back to our normal time. And we'll see you all then. Check out swan.com for Bitcoin IRAs, Bitcoin collaborative self-custody, great, amazing white glove service from John and Steven and the rest of the Swan private team. Check out the app, search Swan Bitcoin in the App Store. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye, everyone.